They said Shadow was trained to obey every order, but that morning, he broke them all. In front of 200 children, Officer Daniel Brooks's German Shepherd partner suddenly lunged, ears pinned, eyes locked on a little girl with a unicorn backpack. The laughter stopped instantly. When Shadow ripped open the bag, everyone thought it was a mistake, until they saw what fell out. A note. Handwritten. Torn. "If you're reading this, please help me. He said he'd make Mommy disappear." That's when Daniel realized Shadow hadn't lost control. He'd found something. Something buried deep in the scent of blood, fear, and a child's desperate hope. What began as a school demonstration became a case that would shake the department, break a family's silence, and prove one thing beyond doubt. Sometimes the bravest officers don't carry guns. They carry hearts that never stop listening. Morning sunlight dripped through the branches like liquid gold, washing over the playground of Maplewood Elementary. It was one of those crisp fall mornings when everything felt a little too peaceful, the kind of morning that made teachers smile and kids forget about math tests. Laughter echoed across the yard. Jump ropes slapped the pavement in rhythm. Sneakers squeaked. A whistle blew. And then there was Shadow. The massive German Shepherd stood tall beside Lieutenant Daniel Brooks, his black and tan coat gleaming in the sun. Every inch of him spoke discipline. The way he held his posture, the way his ears flicked at every sound, the way his eyes scanned the crowd as if reading 100 unspoken thoughts at once. The children gathered in a semicircle, spellbound. Daniel smiled faintly beneath his patrol cap. "All right. Who wants to see Shadow say hello?" A sea of hands shot up. "Shadow," Daniel commanded softly. The dog raised his paw smartly, pressing it against Daniel's palm. The kids erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed. For a brief moment, everything was exactly what it should be. A safe, ordinary school visit. Daniel continued, voice calm and warm. "Shadow here works with me every day. He helps keep our community safe. He can find lost people, smell danger before we see it, and—" He didn't finish. Something in Shadow's body changed. A subtle tension that only Daniel noticed first. The shepherd's tail went rigid. His ears flattened, eyes narrowing into sharp focus. One bark, deep and sudden, cut through the chatter. Then another, louder. The playground froze. "Shadow?" Daniel's tone dropped, but the dog was already gone. He bolted like a fired bullet, claws scraping against asphalt. Teachers gasped. Children screamed. Daniel's heart jolted. His partner never broke command. Never. "Shadow, heel!" he barked. The shepherd didn't listen. He tore across the blacktop toward a small figure near the swing set. A little girl with 2 braids and a pink unicorn backpack. Daniel ran. "Hold the kids! Back! Get them inside!" Everything slowed in the next 5 seconds. Shadow lunged, jaws snapping. Not at the child, but at her bag. The fabric ripped with a sound that sliced the air open. Crayons, snack wrappers, and a small brown-stained envelope spilled out onto the ground. The girl didn't scream. She just stood there, frozen, her hands clutching the straps that were no longer attached. The crowd broke into chaos. Teachers rushed forward. One shouted, "He's attacking her!" "No!" Daniel yelled back, voice cracking. "He's protecting!" By the time he reached them, Shadow was sitting rigidly in front of the girl, chest heaving, teeth bared at nothing, like he was guarding her from an invisible threat. His ears twitched toward the note that lay half-buried under a crayon box. Daniel picked it up carefully. It was sealed, brittle, smeared with something dark, a reddish-brown smudge that looked too old to be spilled juice. "Whose is this?" he asked quietly. The teacher closest to him bent down. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. It came from her bag. Daniel looked at the girl. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" She whispered, barely audible. "Ella." Her eyes met his, not wild with fear, but heavy, hollow. It was the look of someone who'd already seen too much. Daniel's stomach twisted. "You're okay, Ella. Shadow didn't mean to scare you. He stopped when he saw the teacher's expression. She had opened the envelope, her face drained of color. Inside was a folded scrap of notebook paper, torn along the edges. The handwriting was uneven, childlike. "If I tell, he will make you disappear." The teacher staggered back, one hand over her mouth. The paper fluttered from her grip. Daniel caught it before it hit the ground. The playground was silent now, except for the faint, metallic sound of Shadow's breathing and the wind brushing through the swings. Daniel knelt down, lowering himself to Ella's level. "Ella, did you write this?" Her small fingers tightened around the sleeve of her cardigan. She didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't even blink. Her chin quivered once. Shadow inched closer, pressing his body gently against her leg. He wasn't growling anymore. He just stayed there, still, protective, as if he'd understood something no one else could. A few yards away, parents were gathering behind the chain-link fence, confused and murmuring. The principal rushed out, breathless. "Lieutenant Brooks, what on earth?" Daniel raised a hand. "Get the children inside, all of them, now." The principal hesitated only a moment before nodding and shouting orders. The chatter faded into the sound of hurried footsteps. When the yard finally cleared, Daniel stood, staring at the note in his gloved hand. The paper was thin, fragile, the kind a child might rip from a hidden diary. But it wasn't the words that chilled him. It was the faint fingerprint smudged along the bottom edge, too small to be an adult's. He looked down at Shadow, who was still sitting near Ella. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. The shepherd looked up at him, eyes glinting with something almost human. Guilt, maybe, or sorrow. The paramedics arrived minutes later, though no one was hurt. The teacher who'd read the note insisted on sitting down. Ella's mother hadn't been reached yet. Someone called Child Protective Services. Paperwork began forming before anyone even understood what they were dealing with. But Daniel stayed beside the girl. He offered her water. She didn't take it. He asked if she wanted to pet Shadow. She did, but only after a long silence. Her small hand touched the fur on the dog's neck, trembling, hesitant. And when Shadow leaned gently into her palm, her shoulders loosened. For the first time since he'd met her, her eyes softened. Then she whispered something he almost missed. "He heard me." Daniel blinked. "What did you say?" But she'd already turned away, staring at the torn remains of her backpack. "He heard me." The words looped in Daniel's head long after the sirens faded, and the children were led back inside. That night, when the report lay open on his kitchen table and the house sat in darkness, he replayed the moment again and again. The bark, the lunge, the note, the look in her eyes. He poured himself coffee he didn't drink. The air smelled of rain. In the corner, Shadow's vest hung from its hook, the name tag gleaming faintly under the kitchen light. Daniel spoke softly, voice thick. "You heard her, didn't you? Before anyone else did." Shadow lifted his head from the floor, ears twitching. Then, without moving closer, he gave a low, mournful whine, the kind that comes from something deeper than instinct. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft and far away. Inside, Daniel sat staring at the note spread open on the table, its final line smudged by the smallest fingerprint. And in that stillness, he realized something that chilled him more than any crime scene ever had. The little girl wasn't afraid of the dog. She was afraid of going home. The nurse's office at Maplewood Elementary smelled faintly of antiseptic and crayons. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the late morning light into gray bars across the small room. Somewhere beyond the door, the faint murmur of confused voices carried through the hallway. Teachers whispering, administrators trying to sound calm for the parents gathering outside. Inside, the chaos hummed beneath the surface. A school counselor spoke in a soft, measured tone to the trembling teacher who had found the note. The woman's face was ghost pale, her fingers still shaking as she held a cup of untouched water. Every so often, her gaze flickered to the small figure sitting silently on the cot near the window. Ella Carter, the girl with the unicorn backpack. Ella sat perfectly still, clutching her stuffed bear to her chest. The bear was missing one button eye. Its fur was flattened and dirty, but she held it like it was the only thing keeping her breathing steady. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks knelt in front of her, resting his elbows on his knees to appear less imposing. He had taken off his hat and placed it on the counter beside a row of paper towels and a first aid kit. His voice was calm, gentle, the same tone he used with Shadow after a thunderstorm. "Hey, Ella," he said quietly. "Do you remember me? I'm Daniel. You met Shadow outside." No answer. Her eyes didn't meet his. They stayed fixed on the bear's head, her thumb rubbing the fabric near the missing eye until it started to fray. "Shadow didn't mean to scare you," Daniel continued softly. "He's trained to protect people, especially kids. Sometimes he just knows when someone's not safe." Still nothing. The only sound in the room came from the soft panting of Shadow, who now lay curled at the foot of the cot. His tail thumped once when Daniel spoke, then went still again. Every few seconds, he let out a faint, restless whine. Not loud, but enough to vibrate through the quiet, like a heartbeat no one wanted to acknowledge. Daniel glanced toward the doorway, where two forensic officers spoke in hushed tones. One held a plastic evidence bag containing the torn note. Through the cloudy plastic, the words were still visible. The ink looked faint, as if pressed by an unsteady hand weeks ago. "Paper's aged," one of them muttered. "Old notebook stock, but the ink's fresh, probably written within the month." Daniel's superior, Captain Avery, leaned against the frame with arms crossed. "Any chance this is a hoax?" "Kids make up things, Lieutenant." Daniel didn't look up. His voice came out flat. "Not like this." Captain Avery exhaled, his tone softening. "Treat it as a potential abuse case. File it under Code 7. I'll get Child Protective Services looped in. For now, stay with her until her mother arrives." The door closed behind him with a dull click. The nurse excused herself a minute later to check on the teacher, leaving Daniel and Shadow alone with Ella. For a long stretch of silence, Daniel just sat on the floor beside her cot. No notebook, no questions. Just quiet company. He watched how she kept her shoulders rigid, how her shoes dangled above the tile without touching it, how she stared straight ahead like she was bracing for something she couldn't control. Finally, he tried again, slower this time. "Ella, can I ask about your bear?" Her thumb stopped moving. "What's his name?" Her lips parted for the first time, voice small, barely there. "Button." Daniel smiled softly. "That's a good name. I used to have a dog with one ear that stuck up, one that didn't. I called him Trouble." Her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Shadow lifted his head, watching her, carefully. His eyes tracked every movement, every hesitation. When Ella shifted slightly, he inched closer. His chin came to rest on the floor beside her foot. She flinched at first, then froze. A full 10 seconds passed before her hand moved, slow, uncertain, reaching down to touch his fur. When her small fingers brushed the top of Shadow's head, he let out a deep sigh and settled completely, his tail thumping once more before going still. Daniel saw something change in her posture. It wasn't safety. Not yet. But it was the first fracture in the wall she'd built around herself. He took a breath. Ella, that note we found in your backpack. The one that said, "If I tell, he will make you disappear." Did you write that? Her hand stopped moving. Her breathing quickened just slightly, shoulders tightening. Daniel waited. He'd learned long ago that silence told stories too, sometimes louder than words. She didn't nod. She didn't deny it. But the way her thumb pressed harder into Shadow's fur was all the answer he needed. He spoke softly, more to the air than to her. Okay. You don't have to say anything right now. You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. I promise. Her chin dipped. Her fingers curled into Shadow's coat. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, distant but sharp enough to make her flinch again. Shadow's ears twitched, and he lifted his head, pressing closer to her leg. The sight struck Daniel harder than he expected. The way that dog, trained for pursuit and protection, seemed to understand trauma better than most humans he'd worked with. He thought of his own home, empty except for the echo of footsteps and the picture frames turned face down after his wife's accident 2 years ago. Silence had lived there too, heavy and unmoving. He remembered how Shadow had refused to leave his side in those weeks after the funeral, lying at his feet every night, while Daniel tried and failed to sleep. He looked at Ella now, at her small frame wrapped in that same silence, the same kind he'd once mistaken for peace, until he realized it was survival. A knock on the door broke the stillness. A social worker entered quietly, nodding to Daniel. "Her mother's on her way," she whispered. She didn't sound surprised. Daniel's stomach turned. He stood slowly, motioning to the social worker to wait outside. He didn't want to break whatever fragile thread of calm had just settled over Ella. When she was gone, Daniel crouched again, his voice low. "Ella, we're going to talk to your mom when she gets here. You don't have to be scared, all right? You can just stay with Shadow." She didn't answer, but her hand tightened around the bear. Minutes later, when her mother finally arrived, Daniel saw it in her eyes. The exhaustion, the wariness, the too-practiced smile. But that confrontation would come later. For now, it was enough to know the child wasn't imagining her fear. That night, Daniel sat alone in his living room. The house was dark, except for the sliver of light spilling from the porch. The day's report lay open on the coffee table beside his untouched dinner. Shadow rested near his feet, his vest hanging from its hook by the door. Daniel stared at it. The stitched name, the small badge, the faint scuff marks that told the story of every call they'd answered together. He reached over and ran a hand through Shadow's fur. "You heard her, didn't you?" he murmured. His voice cracked on the last word. "She was asking for help." Shadow's ears twitched. Then he laid his head across Daniel's lap. Heavy, warm, steady. Outside, wind brushed through the trees, whispering through the quiet street. Inside, Daniel felt something heavy settle in his chest, the beginning of a connection he didn't ask for, but couldn't walk away from. The girl's silence had spoken louder than any scream, and Shadow, as always, had been the first to listen. The small house at the end of Maple Street looked ordinary from the outside. White paint peeling. A tricycle tipped over on the lawn. Wind chimes tangled in silence. But as soon as Lieutenant Daniel Brooks stepped out of his cruiser, the air felt wrong. Heavy. Still. Beside him, Shadow jumped down, nose twitching, posture stiff. His paws barely touched the ground before a low growl rippled through his throat, deep and instinctive. Daniel exchanged a glance with Karen Holt, the Child Protective Services officer who'd joined him. She was in her 40s, calm but sharp-eyed, a notepad clutched against her chest. "Doesn't look like much," she said softly. Daniel adjusted his badge, voice low. "Places like this rarely do." The curtains were drawn tight even though it was midday. A flickering light glowed faintly behind the fabric, like a single lamp struggling against the dark. Daniel knocked. Once. Twice. A pause. Then the sound of locks, too many of them, clicking one by one. The door opened. Grace Carter stood there, framed in the doorway like a shadow of the woman she might have once been. Her hair is messy, tied back in a half-hearted ponytail. A gray sweatshirt hung loosely from her shoulders. Her smile came late, forced, like she had to remind herself to make it. "Officers," she said, her voice thin. Is there a problem?" Daniel held up his ID. "Just following up on an incident at the school involving your daughter, Ella. Is she home?" Something flickered in Grace's eyes. Worry, irritation, something else. "She's resting. She's had a hard week." Behind her, a man appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered, wiping his hands on a rag. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, veins running thick along his forearms. He smiled too easily. Neil Doran. Daniel recognized the type instantly. Relaxed stance, false charm. The kind of man who thought every room was his. "Afternoon, officer," Neil said, smoothly, stepping forward with his hand out. "Neil, Grace's fiancé." Daniel shook his hand. The grip was firm, too firm. It lingered just a second longer than polite. "Lieutenant Brooks," Daniel said evenly. "This is Officer Holt from CPS. We just want to make sure everything's all right." Neil chuckled. Of course. You know how kids are. Always telling stories, getting into mischief." Behind Daniel, Shadow's growl deepened, barely audible but constant. His gaze never left Neil. Karen gave a small smile. "May we come in?" Grace hesitated. "The house is a mess." Daniel stepped gently past her. "That's all right, ma'am. We won't stay long." The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop. The air inside smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. The curtains blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the room in an unnatural half-shadow. Daniel's eyes swept the living room. No photos, not a single one. The walls were bare except for a cross hanging crooked above the TV. On the floor, a rug covered part of the carpet, except for a corner that was darker, stiff, like it had been scrubbed too many times. A broken picture frame sat face down on a shelf. Daniel bent slightly. A shard of glass still clung to one corner, glinting faintly. He straightened. "Nice place." Neil gave another laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Old, but it does the job." At the far end of the hall, a small head peeked out from behind a doorway. Ella. Her hair was messy, her expression unreadable. When she saw Daniel, she froze, then ducked behind her mother's legs. "Hey, Ella," Daniel said gently. "Remember me? And Shadow?" The dog lowered his head, ears flicking forward. Ella didn't answer. She just held on to her mother's jeans with both hands, her eyes darting to Neil. Neil gave her a smile that made Daniel's skin crawl. "It's okay, honey. They're just asking questions." Daniel decided to push. "About the note we found. The one that said, 'If I tell, he will make you disappear.'" The smile on Neil's face twitched. For a moment his jaw clenched before he laughed, short and loud. "Kids make stuff up, officer. You know that. Imagination and all." Shadow took a step forward. The growl turned sharper, the kind that vibrated through the floor. His eyes locked on Neil's boots. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He crouched slightly, narrowing his eyes. There it was. A faint coppery smell, hidden under the cleaner scent of bleach. Blood. "Step back, Shadow," he said quietly, though the command was more for Neil than for the dog. Neil shifted. "You better control that animal." But Shadow wasn't moving at random. He inched closer, nose tilted down toward Neil's right boot. The toe was stained darker than the rest. Small, rust-colored blotches that didn't belong. Daniel's voice hardened. "You hurt yourself, Mr. Doran?" Neil's mask slipped. Just a flash, anger flickering in his eyes like a spark. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." Daniel's tone stayed even. "Just noticed the stain." Grace looked between them, panic rising. "Please, just leave him alone. Neil's been helping us." But the words broke off when Neil grabbed Ella's wrist. It wasn't rough, not yet, but it was fast, an instinctive motion that screamed control. "Go to your room," he said through gritted teeth. Ella whimpered. That sound, tiny, strangled, was enough. Shadow lunged. Daniel reacted at the same time. "Shadow, down!" But the shepherd was already between them, teeth bared, a snarl tearing through the air. The sound was primal, guttural, echoing off the walls. Neil stumbled back, hitting the edge of the couch. His grip on Ella's wrist broke as he cursed. "Get that dog off me!" "Ella, come here!" Daniel barked. The girl ran straight to him, sobbing silently, clinging to his leg. Shadow stayed planted between them, tail stiff, eyes locked on Neil. Daniel could smell it clearly now. Fear, sweat, and the faint tang of blood. "Enough!" Neil shouted, voice shaking. "I'm done with this!" He turned, bolting toward the back of the house. "Stop!" Daniel called, already reaching for his radio. Neil slammed through the screen door and vanished into the backyard. The gate clattered open. "Shadow!" Daniel shouted. "Stay!" The dog stayed, trembling with adrenaline, teeth still bared. Karen rushed in from the hall, wide-eyed. "What happened?" Daniel exhaled sharply, checking Ella for marks. He grabbed her, then ran. She nodded quickly. "I'll call it in." Grace collapsed onto the couch, face buried in her hands. "I didn't mean for any of this." Daniel cut her off gently but firmly. "Ma'am, where is he going?" I don't know. The garage, maybe. Or the junkyard where he used to work. Please, he's not—" "Don't," Daniel said. His voice was low, dangerous. "Don't defend him." Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance. Daniel knelt down beside Ella, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You did nothing wrong, okay? You hear me?" She didn't answer, just clung tighter to her bear. Shadow pressed close against her side, still trembling but calmer now, his body shielding hers completely. For a long second, the only sound in the room was the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing and the faint creak of the ceiling fan. Daniel stood, his jaw set. "Karen, stay with the girl. I'm going after him." He clipped Shadow's leash, but the dog didn't need it. He was already facing the door, muscles coiled, ready. The hunt had begun. The night had teeth. Rain lashed against the windshield of Daniel's cruiser, each drop smearing the reflection of red and blue lights that spun wildly through the narrow back streets of Maplewood. Sirens wailed in a chorus, echoing off the old brick warehouses and the skeletal outlines of half-demolished homes. "Suspect heading east," came the voice over the radio. "Possible route through the old scrapyard on Lincoln." Daniel gripped the wheel tighter. "Copy that. Shadow and I are close." Beside him, the German shepherd paced restlessly in the back seat, nails clicking against the rubber mat. His breath fogged the partition glass. Every sound outside, the wail, the thunder, the static, only sharpened his focus. When they pulled up to the chain-link gate of the junkyard, Daniel's gut clenched. The place was a graveyard of rust and forgotten things. Mountains of crushed cars, twisted metal, broken dreams stacked high enough to swallow a man whole. Rain slicked the ground, turning the dirt into dark rivers. Steam rose from oil puddles under the harsh glare of a single flickering floodlight. He stepped out. The moment his boots hit the mud, the stench hit him. Gasoline, wet iron, and fear. Shadow jumped down beside him, body coiled tight, head low. His fur bristled as he scanned the maze of steel towers. "Track," Daniel whispered. The shepherd lowered his nose to the ground, sniffed once and moved forward with purpose. They slipped between rows of old machinery and rusted containers, Daniel's flashlight slicing through the darkness. Every beam revealed something broken. Shattered glass, bent license plates, a child's shoe half buried in the mud. The storm made everything move, shadows dancing on their own. "Neil!" Daniel shouted. "It's over! Don't make it worse!" Only thunder answered. Shadow stopped suddenly. His ears snapped up, nostrils flaring. Then he growled, deep and low, like a warning from the earth itself. Daniel raised his flashlight higher. The beam swept across a line of junked cars, over a twisted hood, and caught movement, a shadow slipping between two stacks of metal. He followed quietly, step by step. The rain soaked through his jacket, cold against his skin. Shadow crept ahead, tail rigid, every muscle trembling under the leash. Then, clang. A loud metallic crash echoed through the junkyard. A barrel rolled across the mud, scattering old bolts. Daniel swung the light toward the sound, heart hammering. Out of the darkness, Neil Doran burst forward. His face was pale under the rain, eyes wide, wild. In his hand, a rusted crowbar glinted in the light. "Neil, drop it!" Daniel shouted. But the man didn't hesitate. With a roar, he swung. The metal connected, not with Daniel, but with Shadow. The sound was sickening, a hollow thud followed by a sharp yelp. Shadow stumbled, paw skidding on the wet ground. His side heaved, but before Daniel could reach him, the dog lunged again, snarling through pain. The crowbar clanged against the mud as Neil stumbled backward, slipping. Daniel closed the distance in a heartbeat, tackling him to the ground. They hit the puddle hard, water exploding around them. The crowbar flew from Neil's grasp. "Get off me!" Neil spat, thrashing. Daniel's fist connected with his jaw, once, twice, enough to disarm, not destroy. He rolled the man onto his stomach and yanked his arms behind his back. Handcuffs clicked shut, metallic and final. Neil's voice turned into a growl. "You think you can take her from me? She's mine." "Shut up." Daniel's voice was ice. "You lost the right to say her name." Rain poured harder now, blurring the line between sweat, tears, and blood. Shadow limped toward them, dragging his back leg slightly, fur matted with mud. He lowered his head beside Daniel's knee and let out a shaky breath. Daniel's anger melted into something raw. He reached out, resting a trembling hand on Shadow's wet fur. "You're okay, boy. You did good. The dog's tail gave one weak thump against the ground. Backup arrived moments later, flashing lights washing the junkyard in color. Officers rushed in, hauling Neil up. He shouted curses, struggling until Daniel's glare silenced him. "Get him out of here," Daniel ordered. One officer hesitated. "You need a medic?" Daniel shook his head, wiping rain from his face. "For him, no, but get one for the dog." They nodded and pulled Neil toward the waiting cruiser. He fought, twisted, and screamed something about lies, about stupid cops believing kids. His voice faded under the rising sirens. Daniel stayed kneeling in the mud, one arm still around Shadow. The storm rolled above them, thunder like the echo of everything they'd both been holding back. When the paramedics finally arrived, Shadow refused to be lifted onto the stretcher until Daniel gave the word. "It's all right," Daniel whispered. "You did your job." The dog's eyes found his, dark and glassy, full of pain, but also something else. Trust. Daniel's chest ached. He'd seen men die in the line of duty, partners fall, friends turn cold in his arms. But the idea of losing this dog, this creature who had heard the unspoken cries of a little girl, felt unbearable. "Hang on, partner," he said softly, hand still pressed to Shadow's chest. "You're the reason she's alive." The dog blinked slowly, as if to say he already knew. As they lifted Shadow onto the stretcher, Daniel stood, mud clinging to his knees, rain running down his face. He didn't wipe it away. In the distance, another siren joined the storm, the ambulance carrying Grace Carter and Ella to safety. Daniel watched the red lights fade down the road, a quiet ache pressing behind his ribs. For the first time in years, he felt something close to prayer rise unbidden in his throat. Not for himself, not even for justice, but for the small, broken things in this world that still found a way to fight back. He looked once more at Shadow, who lay on his side under a blanket, breathing slow and steady. The paramedic nodded. "He's tough. He'll pull through." Daniel let out a shaky breath. "Yeah," he murmured. "He always does." He turned his eyes toward the horizon. The storm was easing, the rain falling lighter, softer. The junkyard glistened in the flashing light, and somewhere beneath the thunder, the faint hum of peace began to take its place. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the junkyard. The town had gone back to its usual rhythm, school bells ringing, buses hissing at crosswalks, the hum of daily life pretending that monsters didn't hide behind polite smiles. But inside the quiet corners of Maplewood Counseling Center, the echoes of what happened still lived in a little girl's silence. Ella Carter sat cross-legged at a small table covered with crayons. Her fingers were stained with color. Around her, the walls were painted in soft yellows and blues, the kind meant to make a child feel safe. A clock ticked gently above a shelf lined with stuffed animals. Across the room, Daniel Brooks stood beside Dr. Miriam Hall, the child therapist assigned to Ella's case. Daniel had been visiting once a week, partly as liaison for the department, partly because he couldn't seem to stay away. "She's been quiet," Dr. Hall said softly. "Barely speaks, but she draws. A lot. Sometimes that's how trauma comes out first. In symbols, not words." Daniel nodded, eyes never leaving the girl. Shadow lay near the door, head resting on his paws, his tail flicking lazily against the carpet. He'd recovered from his injury faster than anyone expected. But since that night, he hadn't taken his eyes off Ella, as if guarding her was no longer a job, but a promise. Dr. Hall handed Daniel a stack of drawings. Most were simple: houses, clouds, stick figures holding hands. But one made him pause. A large tree spread across the page, its roots drawn thick and curling into the dirt. Beside it was a crooked swing, and near the base, a small box drawn in brown crayon, half buried. Daniel frowned. "What's this one?" Dr. Hall's expression softened. "She's been drawing that same tree for days, sometimes with different colors, sometimes with rain or snow, always the box underneath." He knelt down beside Ella's chair. "That's a beautiful tree," he said gently. "Looks like it's been around a long time." Ella didn't look up, but her hand paused mid-stroke. "Can you tell me about it?" he asked. A moment of stillness stretched between them. The crayon in her hand trembled, then dropped onto the paper. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "It's from before," she whispered. "Daddy's tree." Daniel's chest tightened. "Your dad's tree?" She nodded once, still not meeting his eyes. "He said it would keep secrets for me." He exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Hall. "Did she ever talk about her father before?" "Only in fragments," the therapist replied. "She said he sang songs. Then one day he was gone. The mother told me he left when Ella was very young." Daniel stood slowly. His mind was already working, connecting pieces that didn't yet fit. He'd read the file. No official record of the father. No divorce documents. No death certificate. Just absent. He crouched again, his voice calm but curious. "Do you remember where the tree was, Ella? The one you used to play under?" Her small hand traced a circle around the roots she'd drawn. "By the swing," she murmured. "Near the old house, Mommy said not to go back there." He felt shadow stir behind him, ears twitching, as if he understood the weight of her words. Later that afternoon, Daniel visited Grace Carter at the temporary apartment provided by social services. She looked thinner, drained, her once careful composure unraveling at the edges. "Lieutenant," she greeted weakly, clutching a mug between shaking hands. "Is Ella all right?" "She's safe," Daniel said. "But she's starting to remember things. About before Neil, about her father." Grace froze. "Her father?" "She drew a tree," he continued. "A big one with a swing. She said it was her dad's tree." Grace's knuckles whitened around the mug. "We used to live out near the edge of town," she said after a moment. "Old farmhouse. Belonged to Michael's parents before they passed. But we lost it. Couldn't keep up with the mortgage. We left everything behind." "Everything?" Daniel pressed gently. Her eyes flicked toward the window. "Please," she whispered. "Don't dig up ghosts." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. "Grace," Daniel said quietly, "if there's something at that property connected to what happened, to Neil or to your husband's disappearance, we need to know." Her expression faltered. For a second, something raw and unguarded flashed through her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the tired, practiced indifference of someone who'd run out of fight. "I don't know what's there," she said finally. "Maybe nothing. Maybe too much." When Daniel returned to his car, the rain had begun again, light this time, tapping gently against the windshield. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat, head turning toward him expectantly. Daniel reached over, scratching behind the dog's ear. "You heard her, didn't you? The way she said it. Daddy's tree." Shadow whined softly, then lifted his nose to the air, as though catching a scent that wasn't there yet. Daniel leaned back, staring out the window. Somewhere out beyond town, that old farmhouse still stood, its roof sagging, its porch probably collapsing under the weight of years. He could see it in his mind. A big oak tree beside a rusted swing, the kind that creaks when the wind blows. The next morning, Daniel met with Captain Avery to request permission to reopen the file on Michael Reed, Ella's father. Avery frowned. "Brooks, that case is a ghost. No missing person report, no paper, trail, nothing." "Exactly," Daniel replied. "Too clean. If he just left, why did Grace never file a report? Why is every trace of him gone?" Avery rubbed his temple. "You're walking into personal territory here." Daniel's tone hardened. "Sir, a child's drawing led us to her abuser before. What if it's leading us to something else now?" A long pause, then, "Fine. You've got 48 hours. But take Shadow and keep this quiet." Daniel nodded. "Understood." That evening, he visited Ella one more time. She was coloring quietly in the therapy room when he entered. He knelt beside her. "Hey, partner," he said softly, nodding toward Shadow. "We're going on a little trip tomorrow, somewhere you might remember." She looked up, eyes wide but calm. "The tree?" Daniel smiled gently. "Yeah, the tree." Shadow wagged his tail once, almost like he understood. As they left, Dr. Hall touched Daniel's arm. "Be careful with what you find, Lieutenant. Children don't imagine trauma. They bury it. And sometimes, when it surfaces..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. That night, Daniel spread Ella's drawing across his kitchen table. The crayon colors glowed faintly under the lamp, the thick roots twisting like veins, the swing hanging crooked, the box hidden in the soil. He traced the lines with his thumb, the waxy texture catching under his skin. Shadow lay nearby, eyes half closed, but every few minutes his tail would twitch, as if dreaming of running through fields or digging under the earth where secrets slept. Daniel looked up, his voice no louder than a whisper. "What's buried under that tree, girl?" The house was silent. The only answer came from the steady rhythm of rain against the window, soft and persistent, like the heartbeat of something waiting to be found. The morning sky was the color of ash. Fog rolled low across the field, curling around the rusted fence posts and the skeletal remains of an old farmhouse. The air smelled of rain-soaked wood and something older. Memory, decay, time itself. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks parked the cruiser at the edge of the overgrown driveway. The tires crunched over gravel that hadn't been touched in years. He stepped out, boots sinking into damp earth. Beside him, Shadow leapt down, sniffing the wind, tail rigid with alert curiosity. The farmhouse looked as though it had been abandoned in the middle of a breath. The front porch slanted, boards sagging, a door hanging crooked on its hinges. A faded wind chime swung in slow motion, its sound thin and brittle. Daniel scanned the yard, the drawing still folded in his pocket. The one Ella had made of a tree, a swing, and a box buried beneath the roots. "Let's find it, partner," he murmured. Shadow padded ahead, nose to the ground, weaving through the tall grass. He paused once, ears pricked, then broke into a steady trot toward the back of the property. Daniel followed, brushing through the wet stalks until the tree came into view. It was bigger than he expected. An old oak, its trunk thick as a car, its branches sprawling like dark veins against the gray sky. The swing Ella had drawn still hung from one high branch, but only one frayed rope remained, creaking with every gust of wind. Daniel stopped a few feet away. The air here felt different, heavier, colder. Shadow circled the base of the tree, sniffing the soil with deep, methodical breaths. Then he stopped. His paw scratched once at the ground, then again. His tail stiffened. "That's it," Daniel whispered. Good boy. He knelt, brushing away the damp leaves. The soil was soft, too soft for land that should have hardened long ago. He reached for the small folding spade he'd brought and began to dig. At first it was just dirt, damp, dark, clinging to his gloves. But then, a faint metallic tang hit the air, sharp and sour, the smell of old rust, or something else. Shadow whined softly, pacing. Daniel's breath came slower now. The deeper he went, the stronger the smell became. The blade struck something solid, wood, dry but dense like old pine. He brushed away more dirt until a small box took shape, no larger than a shoebox, the surface mottled with age. Easy, he muttered, half to himself, half to Shadow. He lifted it carefully. The hinges crumbled at his touch. When he opened the lid, a faint puff of dust rose like a sigh. Inside lay a few objects wrapped in brittle fabric. A silver locket, tarnished but engraved with delicate letters. For Ella. A birth certificate, edges curled with moisture. Ella Marie Reed. And a cassette tape, its label faded but legible. For Ella. Love, Dad. Daniel stared at them, throat tight. The wind pushed through the trees, scattering leaves like whispered voices. Shadow sat beside him, head tilted, watching his every movement. Daniel held the tape up to the light. You've been waiting a long time, he murmured. He bagged the items carefully, then stood, brushing the mud from his knees. The house loomed behind him, hollow and watching. Hours later, back at the precinct, Daniel handed the evidence to the tech unit. Clean it up, restore what you can, he told them. I need that tape playable. When he finally played it that evening in the quiet of his office, the sound filled the room like a haunting echo from another world. Static crackled first. Then came the faint strum of a guitar, halting, unsure. A man's voice followed, soft and low, singing through the distortion. Sleep, little one. The stars are near. Daddy's here. There's nothing to fear. If the night feels long, if the wind won't rest, just know you're safe where you're loved best. The recording hissed and then ended with a quiet laugh. Warm, unmistakably real. Daniel leaned back, eyes closing. The song wasn't perfect. The man missed notes, chuckled at himself halfway through, but it was full of love, the kind you couldn't fake. He played it again and again until the sound filled the room like prayer. When Grace Carter arrived later that night, escorted by a social worker, she looked pale and hollow. Daniel didn't speak at first. He just pressed play. The lullaby drifted out softly through the speakers. Grace froze. Her hand went to her mouth, her knees buckling. She sank into the nearest chair, trembling. I haven't heard that, she whispered, voice cracking. Not since. Her sentence broke into sobs. Daniel watched quietly, giving her space. It was in a box under the oak, he said softly, with Ella's birth certificate, with a locket. Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. He never left us, she choked. I lied. I told everyone he did, but he tried to take Ella that night. Neil stopped him. Daniel's jaw tightened. Stopped him how? Grace's face crumpled. He said Michael was dangerous, said he was taking her away to hurt me, but I never saw him again. I didn't ask. I was scared. I let him bury it all. The words spilled out like confession. Bury what, Grace? Daniel pressed gently. Her hands trembled. I don't know. I didn't want to know. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. You understand what this means, don't you? She nodded weakly. That I helped him, even when I didn't mean to. Shadow shifted near Daniel's chair, letting out a quiet growl, almost mournful. Grace buried her face in her hands. I thought I was protecting her, she whispered. But all I did was keep her in the dark. Daniel stood, walking to the window. Rain tapped against the glass. Slow, steady, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. He looked back at the tape player. The song had ended, but in the silence that followed, the air still seemed full of that voice, Michael Reed's voice, echoing through the years, carrying love that had never reached its child. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, the kind that cut through grief without raising itself. Grace, he said, you and I are going back there. Tomorrow. We're going to finish what you buried. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The tears said everything. He turned to Shadow, who was watching him with those knowing amber eyes. We're not done yet, boy. The dog gave a low rumble in response. Not anger, not fear. Something in between. Daniel replayed the tape one last time as he packed up the evidence. The final words on it, whispered just before the music faded, made the hairs on his arms rise. If you ever feel alone, little one, follow the wind. It'll take you home. Daniel shut off the player. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of truth waiting to be unearthed. And in that silence, he knew. What lay beneath that tree wasn't just a box. It was a story someone had tried to bury, and a little girl who had already begun to dig it back up. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and paper. Sterile, quiet, too clean for the kind of truth that was about to be spoken. Morning light filtered through tall windows, cutting narrow slits across the wooden benches where a few journalists sat, pens poised but restrained. Cameras were banned. The judge had ordered it. This was not a spectacle. This was a reckoning. At the far end of the room, Grace Carter sat at the defense table. Her hands were clasped together, fingers white, nails bitten down to the quick. She looked smaller than Daniel remembered, defeated, drained of the sharpness she once hid behind fear. Daniel stood near the witness stand, uniform crisp but eyes heavy. Beside him, Shadow sat in perfect stillness, the soft glint of his service badge on his vest catching the light. The bailiff opened the side door. Witness entry, he announced quietly. A ripple moved through the room as Ella Carter walked in. She was dressed simply, navy cardigan, white shoes, and around her neck, a small silver locket that caught every glint of light like a heartbeat. In one hand, she held Shadow's leash, in the other, a small, battered cassette player. Every step echoed in the hush. The dog moved beside her in perfect rhythm, his tail low, his gaze steady, protecting, grounding. When she reached the stand, the clerk leaned forward, voice soft. Please state your name for the record. Ella didn't answer. For a moment, the silence stretched, long enough that someone coughed in the gallery. Daniel watched from his corner, every muscle tight, resisting the urge to step closer. Instead of speaking, Ella placed the cassette player on the wooden surface of the witness stand. Her small fingers trembled as she pressed the button. Static filled the room for a second. Then music. The sound was soft, distant, like something carried through time. A guitar. A gentle male voice, the faint squeak of tape. Sleep, little one, the stars are near. Daddy's here, there's nothing to fear. The song wavered. The recording old and fragile, but the emotion behind it, pure and steady, filled every corner of the courtroom. Grace's face crumpled. She bowed her head, shoulders shaking. The judge adjusted her glasses, eyes glistening. When the song ended, Ella didn't move for several seconds. She just stared at the little device, her thumb resting on the pause button, like she was afraid to let the silence back in. Then she looked up. "That's my dad," she said quietly. Her voice was small but carried across the entire room. "He used to sing so I wouldn't be afraid." She paused, the kind of pause that holds years. But one night, he stopped singing. Every word landed like a soft hammer. Grace's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering something in her ear. But Grace didn't respond. Her face was pale, hollowed by the weight of her own choices. Ella looked toward the empty chair at the far end of the courtroom, the one meant for Neil Doran. He had refused to attend, citing medical issues from his arrest. His absence spoke louder than his presence ever could. "He hurt my mom," Ella said, eyes still on that chair. "He hurt me too, but he told me not to tell. He said if I did, Mommy would disappear." A collective murmur stirred through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand, gently restoring order. "You're doing very well, sweetheart," she said softly. Ella nodded once, then reached down and touched Shadow's fur. The dog had been sitting so still that most people had forgotten he was there. His head lifted slightly, eyes meeting hers. "And then he came," she said, motioning toward the dog. "Shadow. He barked when I couldn't. He heard what no one else did." A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the back of the room. Even the stenographer paused for half a heartbeat before catching herself. Ella took a deep breath. Her voice steadied. "People said he was just a dog, but he wasn't. He knew, he always knew." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He'd stood through dozens of trials, seen hardened criminals break down under cross-examination, watched victims shake and shatter. But this was different. There was no fury, no theatrics, just a child reclaiming the sound of her own voice. The prosecutor stepped forward carefully. "Ella," she said softly, "why did you write the note that Shadow found?" Ella looked down, fingers brushing the locket at her neck. "Because I wanted someone to find it," she said. "I was scared to tell out loud, so I wrote it and hid it. I thought maybe someday, someone like Shadow would know." Her eyes flicked toward Grace, who was sobbing silently into a tissue. "Mommy didn't stop him," Ella added, not with anger, but with heartbreak. "I think she was scared too." The prosecutor nodded gently, then stepped back. "No further questions." The judge cleared her throat, trying to compose herself. Her gavel hand trembled slightly before she set it down again. "You may step down, Ella." But Ella didn't move right away. She reached for the cassette player again, rewound it just enough, and pressed play once more. The same lullaby began, soft, imperfect, achingly human. "If the night feels long, if the wind won't rest, just know you're safe where you're loved best." The room stayed perfectly still. Ella looked at the judge, her voice clear this time. "He's gone, but the song isn't." Then she turned toward Shadow, smiling faintly. "Because he listened." The judge dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, composing herself. "Thank you, Miss Carter," she said quietly. "You've said more than enough." As Ella stepped down, Shadow walked beside her, leash slack. The pair passed the rows of onlookers, and not a single person spoke. Journalists scribbled furiously, but no one dared break the spell of that moment. Later, one would write in the local paper. The girl who spoke through silence reminded the court that sometimes the bravest sound in the world is a whisper. Daniel followed them out of the courtroom, his chest tight with something between pride and ache. As the heavy doors closed behind them, the lullaby still lingered faintly in his mind, looping over and over, a promise carried forward by a dog who had heard the cry beneath the silence. The verdict came just after noon. The gavel struck once, sharp, echoing, final. The courtroom exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for hours. Grace Carter sat motionless, her hands trembling on the table as the words, "guilty of obstruction and child endangerment," rolled through the air like a slow bell toll. Neil Doran, though absent, faced his own fate. The judge's tone shifted, colder, harder, as she detailed the charges of murder in the second degree, obstruction of justice, and unlawful imprisonment. The paperwork was being processed even as the room emptied, the weight of his crimes finally meeting the gravity of truth. Grace didn't look up. Her shoulders folded inward. She didn't cry. Perhaps she'd already spent every tear she had. From the back row, Lieutenant Daniel Brooks stood silently, hat in his hands. Shadow lay at his feet, head tilted slightly, as if he understood that something enormous had ended, something that couldn't be undone. When the bailiff called for the next case, Daniel turned to leave. He didn't want Ella to see her mother being led away in cuffs. She'd already seen enough endings for a lifetime. Outside, the autumn air hit him like a soft shock. The courthouse steps glistened under a thin wash of sunlight, the earlier clouds parting like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. A small crowd had gathered, reporters, photographers, curious onlookers, but they all hushed as soon as they saw the little girl walking out. Ella Carter held Shadow's leash in one hand, her small fingers gripping it like a lifeline. Her other hand clutched the silver locket at her neck, the same locket that once lay buried in a box beneath an old oak tree. Daniel crouched as she approached, the brim of his hat dipping low to meet her eyes. "Hey there, partner," he said softly. She didn't answer right away. She looked back once, toward the courthouse doors, where her mother was being escorted away. Her expression wasn't angry, just tired, too tired for someone her age. Shadow pressed close to her side, sensing what no human could name. His tail wagged once, slow and steady, before he leaned his head against her knee. The girl knelt, burying her face into the dog's fur. Cameras clicked quietly, reporters whispering, but the world felt muted around them. After a long moment, she whispered into Shadow's ear, "We did it." The shepherd blinked slowly, his dark eyes soft. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You were brave today, Ella. Braver than most grown-ups I know." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide but calmer now. "Is Mommy going to jail?" He hesitated, just long enough for honesty to matter. "For a while," he said gently. "But she's safe now, and so are you." Ella nodded once as if that was enough. Behind them, the reporters began to close in, questions firing like distant thunder. "Lieutenant Brooks, is it true the K-9 located key evidence at the farmhouse? Is this the first case where a child's testimony was supported by a service dog? Will Shadow be recognized for his actions?" Daniel straightened, his voice firm but kind. "No statements right now," he said. "Let the kid have her piece." Shadow barked once, short, decisive, and the reporters stepped back instinctively. Ella giggled, the sound fragile but real. "He's really good at that." Daniel smiled, the first true smile in weeks. "Yeah," he said. "He's got a way of making people listen." A breeze rolled through the courtyard, lifting the edges of her hair. Somewhere nearby, a church bell chimed noon, blending with the rustle of fallen leaves. Ella reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded card. It was handmade, drawn in bright crayon colors. Balloons, a cake, a big number 9 in the center. She held it out shyly. "It's for you and Shadow," she said. "For my birthday." Daniel took it carefully, as though it were evidence of something sacred. "When's the big day?" "Next week," she said. Then, with a faint grin that nearly broke his heart, she added, "Can Shadow come?" The question hit harder than she could have known. Daniel knelt again, the sunlight catching on the edge of his badge. His voice cracked just slightly as he answered. He wouldn't miss it for the world. Shadow's ears perked at the sound of his name. He gave a small huff, as if confirming it himself. Ella's face lit up, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled without the shadow of fear behind it. They stayed like that for a long while. Just a girl, a dog, and a man who'd seen too much of both good and evil to take quiet moments for granted. The courthouse steps, once heavy with judgment, now felt like a place of release. Above them, the clouds thinned completely, letting sunlight spill over the marble facade. The light reflected in the windows, catching on the silver locket at Ella's throat until it glimmered like a star. "Looks like the sky finally decided to show up," Daniel murmured. Ella tilted her face upward, closing her eyes. "Daddy used to say the clouds move faster after it rains," she whispered. Daniel's voice softened. He was right. The officers by the curb called out to him. Procedural follow-ups, reports to file, but for once Daniel didn't hurry. He just stayed kneeling beside her, letting Shadow lean into both of them. The world outside the courthouse was still far from perfect. There were more cases, more ghosts, more children who didn't yet have someone to listen. But for this moment, in this patch of sunlight, there was peace. When Ella finally stood, she wiped her cheeks and adjusted Shadow's vest. The badge on it gleamed like it belonged there, not just as a symbol of service, but of something far older and purer. Loyalty. "Come on," Daniel said softly, standing and straightening his jacket. "Let's get you something sweet before you go home." She nodded eagerly. "Chocolate?" He smiled. "You've earned it." As they walked toward the car, Shadow trotting proudly between them, a photographer from the local paper lifted his camera one last time, but didn't take the shot. He lowered it again, perhaps realizing some moments didn't belong to headlines. The sunlight followed them down the courthouse steps. The storm was over. The world had shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, quiet ways, like sunlight filtering through leaves after a storm. It had been 6 months since the trial. The chaos of the courthouse had faded into headlines, then into memories, and finally into something softer. Healing. Ella Carter now lived in a small yellow house on Maple Hollow Lane, tucked between rows of maple trees that blazed gold in autumn. A white picket fence framed the yard, and on the porch hung a wooden swing that creaked ever so slightly in the breeze, until Marianne Blake, her new foster mother, fixed it one Saturday morning. Now it didn't creak at all. Marianne was the kind of woman who spoke in gentle tones, who baked bread on rainy afternoons and read out loud in the evenings even if no one answered. She had been a teacher before retiring, and she understood the language of quiet children. For the first time in years, Ella slept through most nights. Not all, but most. Sometimes, when the shadows stretched long across her room, she would sit up and whisper to the framed photo of Shadow on her nightstand. In the picture, the German Shepherd sat proudly beside Lieutenant Daniel Brooks, both of them caught mid-laugh. "Good night," she would whisper to the photo. "We're okay now." On Thursdays, Daniel and Shadow still came to visit as part of the department's Trauma K9 outreach program. It wasn't an official requirement, no one had told them to, but Daniel made sure they never missed a week. The visits took place in the community center's art room, Paint jars lined the shelves, the air always carrying the faint smell of clay and crayons. That afternoon, as light poured through the big windows, Ella sat cross-legged at a low table, a piece of white paper in front of her. Shadow lay at her feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Like always, Daniel watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Every time I think he's off duty, he proves me wrong," he said, with a small smile. Marianne, seated nearby, returned the cartoon smile. "He's her anchor. Some people talk their pain away. She draws hers." On the paper, Ella had drawn a dog with wings, broad and soft, rising into a sky of pale blue crayon. Beside him was a tree with a heart carved into its trunk, and beneath the branches, a small girl held a leash. Above her, in uneven block letters, were two words, "Safe now." Daniel felt something lodge in his throat. Ella looked up, sensing his gaze. She smiled, a real one, not the polite kind children give adults. "He doesn't just bark," she said quietly. "He listens." Daniel crouched beside her. "He does," he said, "better than most people." Shadow gave a soft grunt, tail thumping once against the floor, as if confirming the truth. That night, a local reporter visited the community center to cover the story. She took photos of Ella's drawings, her hands smudged with color, and of Shadow sitting proudly by the easel. The headline that ran the next morning in the Maplewood Gazette read, "The Dog Who Heard the Silence." It spread faster than Daniel expected. Soon other papers picked it up. The story moved across counties, then states. TV hosts mentioned it, always ending with the same line, "Sometimes heroes don't speak, they listen." At first, Daniel worried the attention would overwhelm Ella, but instead, something else happened. Other children began to draw. It started with a boy named Marcus, age 9, who had been living in a shelter 2 towns over. He'd seen the story on a small television in the recreation room. He didn't talk much either. But the next day, his counselor found a drawing on his desk, a dark room, a small bed, and a figure sitting in a corner with wide, terrified eyes. The caption read, "This is where the bad things happen." The counselor alerted authorities. Within a week, investigators uncovered an illegal foster home operating under false records. 3 children were rescued. When Daniel heard the news, he sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the printed report. Across the bottom, someone had scribbled in pencil, "The Ella Effect." It wasn't official, but it was real. The art therapy sessions grew each week. Children came from all over, some withdrawn, some angry, some silent. The walls of the community center filled with color. Crayon dogs, broken hearts stitched back together, families drawn with halos above their heads. Ella stood by her easel while the others painted around her. She drew a hill with a small tree on top. When Daniel walked in, she looked up. "It's his tree," she whispered. "Your dad's?" She nodded. "But this time it's growing again." He swallowed hard. Shadow brushed against his leg, steady as ever. Marianne joined them, wiping her hands. "You know," she said, "I think you two saved more children than you'll ever know." Daniel shook his head. "Not me," he said. "Her and him." He nodded toward Ella and the shepherd. That evening, as the sun sank low, Daniel and Shadow stayed behind. The room was quiet, filled with the soft rustle of drying paper. On the wall hung a collage of the children's art. At the center was Ella's piece. The winged dog, the heart-carved tree, the word safe. Daniel rested his hand on Shadow's head. "You did this," he murmured. The dog looked up, amber eyes patient and kind. Outside, the yellow house on Maple Hollow Lane glowed beneath the porch light. Inside, Ella lay asleep, Clover the stuffed bear tucked under her arm. Marianne hummed softly in the hallway. For the first time in a long while, the nightmares were gone. And when the wind moved through the trees outside her window, it carried a rhythm, half whisper, half melody. Sleep, little one. The stars are near. Daddy's here. There's nothing to fear. The sound wasn't real, not in the ordinary sense. It lived in the quiet place where love and loss meet. For Ella Carter, that was enough. Healing had begun, not with words, but with listening. The auditorium held a reverent hush. A soft piano played in the corner. On stage, banners read, "Honoring our heroes, service, courage, and compassion." But everyone knew this day wasn't about titles. It was about one dog, one girl, and the silence that became a voice. Shadow, now older, sat beside Daniel near the front. His muzzle was graying, but his eyes still burned bright. He caught every sound, the crowd's murmur, the faint click of cameras. Backstage, 10-year-old Ella clutched her note cards. Her blue dress shimmered under the lights, a silver locket resting against her collarbone. Daniel crouched beside her. "You ready, kiddo?" "I think so." Shadow nudged her hand. She smiled. "He's ready too." Daniel grinned. He always is. When the announcer called her name, "Please welcome Ella Carter, representing the K9 Hearts for Hope program," applause rose like a wave. She stepped out, small but sure. The crowd leaned forward. For a moment she didn't speak. Then, in a voice soft as morning rain, she began. "I used to think silence kept me safe. That if I didn't talk, the bad things would stop. But it didn't keep me safe. It just kept me hidden." The room stilled. Shadow didn't need me to talk. He listened anyway. He heard what I couldn't say. He barked when I couldn't scream. Because of him, people started listening too. A tear rolled down a woman's cheek. Daniel clasped his hands tight. Ella lifted her eyes again. "When I was scared, he sat beside me. When I drew things no one understood, he did. And now," she smiled, voice trembling, "now I listen too, to other kids, to quiet places, to the things people try to hide." She reached toward Shadow, who sat below the stage. The shepherd placed his paw in her hand, as he always had. The room melted into silence so deep it felt sacred. Even the mayor wiped his glasses. The pianist shifted into a gentler tune, almost a lullaby. "Thank you for listening," Ella said. "Not just to me, but to the silence." Applause rose, warm and steady, swelling until the hall seemed to breathe. When it faded, the MC spoke. "For extraordinary service and compassion that has saved lives, today we honor K9 Shadow of the Maplewood Police Department." Daniel led Shadow to the stage. An officer pinned a medal to the dog's vest. Cameras flashed. People stood. Daniel knelt, whispering, "You did it, boy. You really did." Shadow leaned against him, fur glowing under the lights. Afterward, people lingered, smiling through tears. Along one wall hung Ella's framed drawings. The heart tree, the winged dog, the word safe. Sunlight poured across them like gold. At the end of the display was a sign, K9 Hearts for Hope. It wasn't just a name. It was the start of something larger. Therapy dogs now visited schools, foster homes, and shelters across the country, helping children speak through art and trust. A legacy born from one bark, one child, one quiet act of courage. That night, Lanterns lit the courtyard. Daniel and Ella sat on the steps, hot chocolate steaming between them while Shadow rested nearby. Ella traced the medal on his vest. "Does this mean he's retiring?" Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, he's earned it." "Will he still visit?" "Every week," he said. He wouldn't have it any other way. Shadow sighed, resting his head on her lap. The moon climbed higher, silvering the trees. A night bird called out, soft and free. Ella looked up at the stars and felt something new: peace. Later, Shadow lay by Daniel's fireplace, tail thumping each time his partner passed. On a nearby wall hung Ella's drawing, "The Dog Who Heard Me." In a new children's center, kids colored beside therapy dogs, laughter filling the room. The story that began in fear had become something larger. An anthem carried by every K9, every child brave enough to speak without words. "Life doesn't always scream," Daniel once said. "Sometimes it just goes quiet." The brave ones aren't the loudest. They're the ones who still hear. Shadow's tail thumped twice. His eyes closed, the firelight flickering gently across his face. Outside, the world was quiet again. Not the silence of pain, but the kind that means peace, earned and shared. In the end, stories like Ella and Shadow's remind us that love doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it wags its tail, leans close when we're hurting, or simply stays by our side when the world feels too heavy. German Shepherds, with their loyalty and quiet courage, have a way of showing us what trust truly means. They listen when no one else can. They see the truth in us before we even say a thing. If this story touched something in you, maybe it's because you've felt that same kind of bond. If you'd like to learn how to deepen it, there's a wonderful resource I've been using myself that shares gentle ways to connect more meaningfully with your own dog. You can look it up anytime. It's easy to find, and it's worth every quiet moment you'll share together. Take your time with it. Sit with your dog tonight. Maybe scratch behind their ears and just listen. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not to teach them something new, but to remember how much they've already taught us.